Okay. As far as I can tell, this meeting is being recorded, and I'm going to try to do it a chapter at a time. So, part of the problem is with these is there a tremendous amount of bandwidth, and just to make sure I have enough bandwidth, I'm going to break it up into pieces. Okay. 3 chapters, and I've done the homework, and I know because I've taught this class before. I know there are a handful of things that you have to understand. Once you get them, you can reason through the answers, but we may have to do a session during the week to help people with this, because um, the first time through, it's just not easy to get your head around, but I'll see if I can give you the tools to do it. And we'll see what happens. If we have to, we'll do a Zoom session Wednesday or Thursday night. Okay. Demand and supply. There are some ideas with this basic graph of supply and demand that you have to master to do this homework, and it will help you throughout the course. It's as fundamental as adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing in a math course. Okay. A competitive market has enough buyers and sellers where no one player can influence the market. Um, Things that influence demand, we'll talk about those. You have a lot of questions about substitutes and complements. Once you learn those rules, you can apply them and just use logic. And then supply and demand determine prices and quantities bought and sold. That is a quiz question. What determines price? Okay. And they both do. Yeah. And so when probably the single most helpful thing we'll go over in this chapter is how to know from the language, and there's only a couple words changing, but they're two completely different things that they'll test your knowledge on. One is the concept of a change in demand, and the other is a concept, change in quantity demanded, two completely different things, and we'll go over that. My point is that as you go through the homework, you'll want to look very carefully at the language, and it will tell you what you need to know. So let's get started. Okay, there is a question about a market, what the definition of a market. And a competitive market is where the sellers are price takers. In other words, the market sets the price, and the firm only decides how much to sell. Okay, here's some language. The money price of a good is the amount of money needed to buy it. And you should stop and ask yourself why we would call it the money price. What other kind of price can there be? Well, you should remember from last week that we had something called an opportunity cost. So we actually described the value or benefit of something in terms of what was given up, such as we had on the production side with the production possibilities frontier, right? And so the money price, money is a medium of exchange, but in some of these models, we've talked about giving up so much of another good or resource to consume an extra good of, or produce another good of something else. So the money price is where price in dollars or whatever currency is the medium of exchange. Okay, and then the opportunity cost is a little bit different, the relative price. So that's how we're making that distinction. I didn't see a question specifically testing your knowledge of this definition, but it's good. It's good to understand the difference. Okay. Notice the difference between the quantity demanded. Okay. That's usually what we see along the horizontal axis of the graph. And we'll be looking at graphs here in a minute. So a want is a desire or a wish. Unfortunately, because of scarcity, we can't have everything we want, but it does give us a sense of what our preferences are and about the benefits we derive or how much we derive. So let's see. The law of demand, there is a definition question on this. And as I explained in class, the higher the price of a good, the smaller the quantity demanded. That makes sense. I mean, we all behave that way, don't we? And so, assuming that for the consumers or the buyers in a given market, assuming that their preferences or their income or their choices for similar goods called substitute goods, if none of those things come into play, the price of the good determines the quantity demanded. Okay, that should make sense. But I want you to listen to the language that I used here. Assuming that no other forces are acting on this market, the change in price changes the quantity demanded. And we can find out by how much by looking at the shape of the demand curve. And then we'll get into something called elasticity, which gives us a way to measure how much. How much the quantity demanded changes when the price changes. And so, yeah, the substitution effect, well, let's get into the definition. So naturally, when the price of one good, the relative price goes up with respect to other goods, people seek substitutes for it. So in a market, this drives this elasticity concept that we'll talk about very soon. But you all experience this. If one store on your street is expensive and the other store has stuff that's just as good, but the prices are lower, I would imagine that you would shop at the place where the prices were lower. And so the demand for the more expensive store would go down, okay? And the demand for the less expensive store would go up until the market maybe match them up, where one might lower their prices, the other might raise their prices, and so on. Now, so the relationship between a substitute or a good and a substitute, you should be able to reason out now. If I don't care whether I have, now I have to come up with the crazy food choices. Pizza or hamburgers, back to the fast food theme that we see in the textbook a lot. Then if pizza goes up, I'll eat more hamburgers. So notice that the price of pizza went up, and I just got done explaining how the price changes how much I will demand. So the quantity demanded for pizza will change. Okay. So notice how the difference here is that the quantity demanded of the good or service decreased because the price went up. Okay. And so that will cause the cheaper good that acts as a substitute, that will cause the demand for that good to increase and the price will go up. So we'll get into that in a minute. The income effect has to do with changes in preferences and benefits based on changes in income. And that's an important idea. There are some goods that actually don't go up when your income goes up. We call them inferior goods. And we'll talk about those. But when I was in college or under a tough budget, I'd buy ramen noodles and eat those because they were cheap and they would fill you up. And so when I started making more money, I bought fewer ramen noodles. Ramen noodles are an inferior good because the demand is inversely affected by income. When income goes down, the demand for the inferior goods go up. When income goes up, the demand for inferior goods goes down. So that will come into play later. All right, so now the idea of the demand curve is a way to build the concept of aggregate demand that shows you the demand for a given good or service as measured by all the people who represent the buyers or the demand for that product. And so as they talk about it, planned purchases and all the other things remain the same. So the demand curve tells us, based on the preferences and plans and wants, how these consumers react to price in terms of how much of it they'll buy. And so in this example, they're trying to explain how, depending on the price, you'll have an aggregate demand of a certain amount. And as you can see, this slopes down from left to right. That's your first clue. Anytime you see a graphic representation that is linear or curvilinear like this one, if it slopes down from left to right, that's a negative relationship. So you're going to have one variable goes up and the other goes down, or vice versa. In this example, as with all demand curves, when price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. When quantity demanded goes down, price goes up. Price is usually viewed as the driver. The quantity demanded is a response to price. And so all they've done in the table is graph out what you see in the chart. Okay. And so when price goes up, it changes quantity demanded. So be sure to think in terms of price being the driver in this case. And I don't know why my mic is making all that noise. Sorry. Okay. So price changes quantity demanded. And when price moves, we see movement along the curve. This is one of the two things I want you to distinguish between, namely the idea that when nothing else changes, the preferences don't change, the buyers, they don't have more income, there's no substitute price changes. The price changes causing movement along the curve down to the new price or up to the new price and over to the new quantity demanded. All we're doing is moving along the curve. Notice they said a rise in price brings a decrease in the quantity demanded. They did not say it decreased demand. That's a completely different thing, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. So this is the clue. distinguish between quantity demanded and movement along the curve and a change in demand, which means the nature of the curve is changing, the preferences have changed, or substitutes have been introduced, and the whole curve moves. So that's what we're going to try to make clear in this chapter, among other things. Yeah, so the price drives the quantity demanded, not the demand, the quantity demanded. And we move, as you can see now with the arrow, along the curve. Critical language, and there are going to be questions where you're going to have to identify the differences in the language between change in demand or supply when we get there, and change in quantity demanded. Okay, so change in quantity demanded is a response to a change in price, and it's just movement along the curve which hasn't changed. Okay. Okay, and we've gone through this before. I don't remember any willingness and ability to pay definitions. So just bear in mind that there are two things happening here. One is that we think in terms of, when the price is lower, it makes me feel empowered that I can buy more. But it's also the idea that if you want me to consume that much, it's got to be cheap because I don't derive as much satisfaction when I use that much. So there's a little bit of the utility diminishing with more consumption of the same thing. And we all understand that. So we did talk about marginal benefit. And you should ask yourself if you remember what it means real quickly. Marginal benefit, and I hope this is what you remembered, is the incremental benefit I get from the consumption of one more unit. And there are a lot of questions that ask you to look at a chart and answer the question, what is the marginal benefit for the 14th item or the third item or whatever it is? And so we'll go over that. I want to go back because, for example, well, here they're jumping from 5 million bars per week at a time. But from C to B, for example, you see the marginal benefit being dropping 50 cents per bar between the, let's just say this was 10 and 15 instead of 10 million and 15 million. And so they'd want you to be able to identify, and I'll try to write on here now. So they'd want you to be able to identify the change in benefit based on the change in price from the 10th bar to the 15th bar. Okay. And the difference is just 50 cents, and that will be the answer. Okay. So for the 15th bar, I get $1 worth of benefit. And on the 10th bar, I get $1.50. Well, somewhere in between there, I needed to get, the price had to be lower for me to consume more because I get less benefit out of the 15th one than I did for the 10th one. Okay. All right. So that idea, that concept of the marginal benefit or marginal cost is for the next item, the change in benefit from the 10th to the 15th, or when we get into cost, we'll do the same thing. These concepts are all over the homework. So if I can get this to advance, there we go. Now, here's the other term or concept that's essential to master or grasp here. So when we talk about a change in demand, we mean that something, the preferences or the choices or the income, something made people willing to buy more or less at the same price than they did before. So when people get suddenly the employment goes up, or a new company just hired a bunch of people in the city, or taxes went down, whatever it is, people have more money to spend. So at $1 instead of quantity demanded of 20, maybe the new quantity demanded is 25. And so the language they use is the demand curve, and we'll use the same language with supply. We'll say that it shifts, and it shifts rightward, and that's going to be true for supply too. A lot of people, when they think it's shifting, it's going up. Don't think that way. Think it goes to the right, goes out. And we'll look at some graphs that demonstrate that. So now we're talking about a change in demand. What we mean is we have a new curve. The curve has shifted, changed its position or shape, and there are several parts of the homework that test your understanding of the difference between a change in demand or a shift and just movement along the curve caused by, in other words, movement along the curve, in other words, change in quantity demanded because of a change in price. I hope this is making sense. If it is, you've taken a nice step forward. Okay, now we're talking about things that cause a change in demand, that affect the location of the curve itself. The prices of related goods, whether they're substitutes or complements. We'll talk about that. Complements are things that go together. You could think peanut butter and jelly. Um, you could think computers and software. Um, Substitutes are things that we buy that give us about the same benefit as another thing. And so when I can't, um, when I can't go running, I go swimming or something. Maybe for me, that's a substitute. Or if I can't um, rent a movie on Netflix, I buy it at Redbox, maybe. Okay. Those are substitutes, and they do play an important role. Expected future prices. Yeah. I mean, that's most of these you can relate to your own practices, and we all practice making these kinds of decisions, but we don't even think about it. It's instinctive. If I think prices are going up in the future, I'm on the second bullet now. Why would I wait to buy something? I would buy it now, right? If I think future prices are going down, why would I buy it now? So that's one thing that can cause a shift in the curve, in the demand curve, or a change in demand. Income is obvious. Expected future income. Yeah, I don't know about you, but if I just got a raise or a new job before I get my first paycheck, I might feel a little more flush and spend some money. Population, yeah, more people implies more consumers, a larger market, more demand. Okay, so that would naturally change how much would be demanded, what the quantity demanded would be at any given price. So all other things the same, if more people move into the area, demand should shift out, and we'll look at what that looks like on a curve. Preferences, of course, suddenly, if it's fashion or food preferences or different kinds of services, maybe people don't go to the movies; they go, um, they go on Netflix, or they stream stuff on their phones or tablets. Okay, those kind of things change the marginal benefit and change the nature of the curve. Okay, these are testable, and you have to reason them out. A substitute, if a good has a lot of substitutes, it's going to be very sensitive to changes in price. I don't know about you, but if I'm in the, I don't know, the potato chip aisle, and I see that with all the brands, I mean, you walk down that aisle, there have to be 5 or 6 major brands of potato chips. And they're all salty and bad for you, maybe, but they all give me that same fix when I need something salty, and I don't know. So my point is, when I have all those choices, the first thing I look for is where's the sale, and it's the same with soda and a number of other things. So very price sensitive, and that should make sense to you. A complement, however, doesn't behave the same way. Let's go back to substitute for a second. If one potato chip maker raises their price, I'm going to buy the one that I consider a substitute because it's cheaper. And so the demand for the substitute went up in this case because they did not raise their price. So these are changes in demand. Substitutes can see a shift in the curve because a related good went up in price and people flocked to the cheaper good. And so that's a change in the curve. That's a change in demand. Now, complement doesn't behave the same way. So a substitute, you have to think in terms of what happens to the price or the demand. So when one substitute goes up in price, the demand for its substitutes go up in price. Okay, so they have a positive relationship. If a good that has a lot of substitutes goes down in price, the other substitutes will go down in price too, because people won't buy as much because they have a substitute that's cheaper. A complement, however, goes the opposite way. So if the demand so if the price of computers, PCs goes up, the idea is, well, that's going to make the demand for software, Microsoft or whatever it is, go down. Because remember, when something becomes more expensive, we are willing to consume less of it. So the price of a complement is going to go the opposite, the quantity, the demand for a complement is going to go the opposite way of the price. So it says down below, you can see that it's a positive relationship for substitutes. When the price of one substitute goes up, when the price of a substitute for an energy bar rises, or when the price of a complement falls, okay, they're trying to say them both at once. But you should understand that when the price of a substitute rises, the demand of a substitute rises. When the price of a complement falls, the demand for the complement increases. So the best way to think about that is how you behave when something you buy goes up in price. You demand more of the substitute because it's cheaper. Complements are related things that you would normally buy together. If the cost and everybody, I think, well, I'm not going to project anybody's preferences, but for example, razors and blades. Um, razors go up in, or blades go up in price. I'm not going to buy as many razors because they just became more expensive. So the demand for razors went down because the blades went up. I'm spending a lot of time on this, but it's in the homework, and it's critical because not only does it help us understand the things that affect the demand for a good, but it also helps us with this idea of distinguishing between price and changes in quantity demanded, changes in price and changes in quantity demanded, or changes in demand. And so we're talking about both of these things at the same time. So the price of a substitute goes up, that changes the demand for the other goods that you can substitute for. Tricky stuff, and I'm trying not to make it more confusing, but some of the graphs in the book do a good job of explaining this. Don't hesitate to pull the book out and look at some of the graphs and the reading and see if that helps. If not, I do encourage you to go to Khan Academy and look up economics, supply and demand, and watch a couple modules. He does a great job of drawing, telling stories, and trying to explain things in normal language before using the economics language. So use whatever tools, and if you have questions, you can text me or email me, whatever you like, and we'll see if we can't demystify this stuff. So these two I talked about, but notice income and a normal good. Well, a normal good is where, well, yeah, I just got a raise, so I buy more stuff than I used to at all prices. That's a shift in demand. But we talked about an inferior good where you actually buy more of it when your income goes down because it's cheaper. Some examples in the past have been I ride the bus more when my income is down, and when my income goes up, I'll either take a cab or buy a car or something. Maybe I rent one of those fancy new scooters. And there you go. They want you to know what an inferior good, how it acts. And it's important to know that we will be talking about elasticity, and that's just a way to measure how sensitive the demand is to price, how sensitive, how sensitive the quantity demanded is with regard to changes in price. And an inferior good is actually going to go the opposite way. And so that'll come into play later. But first, you have to understand why we call it that and what that means. Okay. And so I don't want to get into this. Population makes sense. Preferences we explained. Okay. This is the graphic representation of a shift in demand, aka a change in demand, aka demand increases. I think it's helpful to know that the curve is moving out and to the right. When you get to supply, you might be tempted to put the new curve higher than the old curve. That's not correct. That's a decrease in demand. We'll take a look at that in a minute. This is it right here. Okay. Price changed, quantity demanded changed. Okay. Movement along the curve. A shift in the curve or a change in demand, notice how at the same price level, by where the arrow is, there's a black circle there. Notice that at the same price, there's a new larger quantity demanded. Okay, this is a shift in demand. It's an increase in demand. It's a change in demand. Something changed, something affected buyers' preferences and benefits and so on. Okay, and notice to the left, decrease. Okay. And so we talked about the things that change demand, and it usually, as I said, and it will serve you to think of it this way, a demand curve is a benefit curve. And so when we see that the benefits change based on related goods or income levels, whatever it is, then the demand can change. The curve actually moves. Same with supply, except that supply is a cost curve. So anything that affects cost will change the supply curve, the shape of it, the position of it. So anytime some new technology comes in, well, that makes the producers more efficient. They'll produce more at the same price. The curve shifts out and to the right. Okay. If costs go up, wages, whatever it is, transportation, that's going to shift the curve back and to the left because it is a cost curve. And if costs go up, they're willing to produce as much at the same price because they can't afford it. They're hitting their marginal costs sooner. So hold on one second. Okay, so the law of supply states that the higher the price of a good, the greater the quantity supplied, and the lower the price of a good, the smaller the quantity supplied. And that goes back to the idea of the supply curve as a cost curve. You could also say, well, if the price is higher, the producers get a better price. They like that. You can think of it that way, but I think it's better for our purposes if we think of the supply curve as a cost curve, and that'll become clear in the upcoming chapters. But when costs are higher, the firms have to they have to produce a larger amount or to meet their costs. So we'll see what that looks like graphically in a minute. Okay. Yeah, they have to cover their marginal costs. Marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Say that 10 times. Okay, so the supply curve, you should notice immediately that the curve slopes up from left to right. It's a positive relationship. Price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. Okay. And there's the schedule of how much they'll supply at each price. And by linking these dots, we get this curved. Okay. And so again, the price rising drives the amount produced. All other things equal. And so they call the supply curve a minimum supply price curve. The idea there is that people aren't going to produce it at a loss, or they're not going to supply goods above the cost of producing the next good. And we're interested in the marginal cost here. I'll talk about this briefly, but when we look at curves like this that refer to microeconomics in the firm, we're usually talking about very short-term curves that assume that they don't have time to buy more plant and equipment and expand. The idea is that on the short term, it actually costs more to produce more. And that's true. because you're assuming that you're holding capital spending constant. Maybe you can add labor, but you can't add more equipment. And that assumption helps explain why it costs more to produce the next item. If you've ever tried to share equipment at a job or registers or whatever, phones or whatever it is. Okay. The lowest price is the marginal cost. Okay. You break even on the last one. All right. Now we're going to talk, and remember, let's review that concept of movement along the curve. So when the price rises, and here you can see that if it goes from $1 to $2, the supply would go from point B, which is about 6 million bars, to point D, which is 14 million bars. And all we did was see how the price changed the quantity supplied, and we moved along the curve. When we heard the price went up, we follow along the curve to see what the new level of supply is, right? Just driven by a change in price. Nothing else is going on. But now we're going to talk about things that change the curve itself, a change in supply. Now something either costs more, or somebody's more efficient, or there are new suppliers in the market, and we'll look at some of these. But I do want to repeat that when supply increases, the supply curve goes out to the right. I remember when I first saw this material years ago, I thought that if it went up, it was increasing, but it goes out to the right. Decreasing is when it goes to the left. So yeah, the cost of the inputs are going to cause the curve to shift back up and to the left, go down. In other words, supply will go down. They'll produce less because it's more expensive. Their costs are higher. And then the number of other suppliers. When you lose suppliers, supply decreases. When you increase suppliers, new companies enter the market, supply increases, shifts out. Technology shifts it out. Okay. I didn't see a lot about expected future prices on the homework, but if I think prices are going to go higher in the future, then people are going to, then sellers are going to sell less today, right? Because if they wait, they can get a higher price. So you have to reason them out. Think like you would if you were a company, and how you would react to these situations. But remember, on the short term, okay. And state of nature, that's often weather patterns, or we'll see what that looks like. Yeah, the factors of production: labor, land, capital, okay. Related goods substitutes. The supply of a good increases if the price of a substitute in production falls. Okay, so a substitute for in production is for a good is another good that can be produced using the same resources. So I think it's important to distinguish here between being able, if a company has the equipment to, let's say they can, let's just say they can produce wheat or corn. And if the price of corn goes down, they're going to plant more wheat or harvest more wheat, right? That should make sense. But don't confuse yourself in this case between other companies producing the good and competing. In this example, the company can produce either one using its equipment, like the example of the farm and the harvesters and combines. And I mean, I realize that you might need different equipment for one or the other. Goods are complements in production if they have to be produced together. Here again, we're talking about production at the same company, and they're shifting their mix of goods based on the equipment they have. And so if the price of a complement, they have to be produced together. I'm trying to think of the example here. I always struggle with that. Let's see. Goods that have to be produced together. Okay, so maybe curds and whey. You make cheese. Well, you can't make if you make cheese, you're going to have curds or whey, and so yeah. If the price of a complement rises, well, you're going to produce more. We just talked about that. It's one of the things that changes. If the price of a complement rises, I'll produce more of that moving along the curve, but it will cause the demand for the other thing that I produce with that to go up. Should make sense. Or I shouldn't say the demand. Should cause me to produce more of the other good. Supply goes up. Okay. All right. The number I didn't see a lot of questions in the homework about future prices, but I did see a couple questions where they introduce new suppliers and they want you to understand that that's going to shift the curve out, the change in supply, because now at every price more will be produced across the curve. Okay. And technology, you can think of cost savings or efficiencies that will shift the curve out to the right. You'll be able to produce, or willing to produce, more at the same price than you did before. That should make sense. The state of nature, yeah, natural forces, the weather. Right now we're going to have problems with the orange crop probably in Florida. I don't know. Okay, so decreases supply. The curve comes back. Notice it's shifting the curve here. Okay. And so now you can see what we mean when a curve shifts out because of some efficiency technology, for example. You can look at D and D1 and C1 and that arrow. And you can see that at the same price they're supplying more quantity supplied. So that's a change, a shift in supply, and that should make sense. Notice also that the supply is out and to the right to show an increase. And then here we are with the idea of movement along the curve, just driven by changes in price and changes in the nature of the market. Notice how supply decreases to the left and increases to the right. Buy or sell more at the same price. I think by now you should be, I'm hitting this pretty hard, but it's a big part of the homework. Decrease in demand or supply is a shift in the curve. Changes in quantity demanded or supplied are merely movement along the curve responding to changes in price. Okay. The equilibrium price is where supply and demand intersect. It's that simple. There are a lot of questions about this, and where the equilibrium, the equilibrium quantity is the quantity bought and sold at the equilibrium price. But I mean, there are a lot of questions. They just want you to understand that this is the most efficient place for the society or that market to operate for everybody concerned, buyers and sellers. It has, we'll talk about it, but it's called the total surplus. In other words, the most people get, well, the consumers get the best price based on their willingness to pay, and the sellers get the maximum benefit based on their cost. And so that equilibrium creates the most efficient use of those resources. And notice how price regulates where that equilibrium, I mean, it helps when we don't have equilibrium, the price adjusts until we do. It naturally moves toward equilibrium. So you can see the equilibrium here, where the two curves cross, and the equilibrium quantity is 10 million, and the equilibrium price is 10. Okay, it's the amount demanded and the amount supplied, and so on. What they're trying to point out here, and this is new language now, when the price is $2 and you go on the vertical axis up to price, and I haven't done much drawing here, so you can see that we have a problem. Consumers at $2 only want to buy, what is it, 7? That's what it is over here. So 7. And guess what? At $2, the firms or producers are willing to supply 13. Well, you've heard this language before, but whenever you have more available for sale than people are willing to purchase, you have a surplus. And, you know, they have places like overstock.com. And so on the short term, when the price is above the equilibrium price, you have a surplus. And the quantity supplied is above the equilibrium quantity. You should see that 13 million supplied is above the 10 million equilibrium. And they're going to ask you to understand this. Correspondingly, we're going to look at the opposite situation, and I'll have to clear this and go to the next one, I hope. Okay. So they want you to know, by the way, I drew lines for 7 and 13, and you can see from the little text box on the chart that there was a surplus of 6 million bars because suppliers were willing to produce 13 million. Consumers were only willing to buy 7. And so they'd want you to identify that amount, but they'd want you to visualize this or even draw it yourself. If you see the question, you know, have some scrap paper and draw your charts and help yourself visualize this, or keep the PowerPoints handy so that you can refer to them, or have the book open to the page with this. This comes from a page in the book. All right, now we're going the other direction. And they want you to understand that when the price is below the equilibrium price, you have consumers willing to buy more than the suppliers are willing to sell. And in this case, suppliers only want to sell 6 million. And over here, I'll have to annotate it, but they only want to do 6 million, produce 6 million at $1. But consumers love the low price, and they're willing to buy 15 million. So we have a shortage of 9 million. And that process, as you can imagine, Some of the um, some of the, let's see, consumers. Some of the consumers are willing to buy the bars at $1, and some of the suppliers lower their price, and the market will eventually naturally work back toward that equilibrium. Or you could have suppliers drop out of the market and say, I can't do business at $1. And so the supply would decrease, and you would know then, by the way, because you're going to be tested on it, you would know then that if some of the suppliers dropped out and said, I can't make any money at $1, the curve would go that way, and the price would move up. So anyway, I'll let them do more of the graphing because their graphs are neater than mine. So there was a shortage when the price was below the equilibrium. So at the equilibrium price, there's no shortage or surplus. But you want to know what that language, and you want to know what it looks like. And as you can see, the supply, when the supply is greater than the equilibrium quantity, it depends on whether or not the price is above or below the equilibrium. But you can, I mean, if you draw this, you can figure out whether it's a shortage or a surplus pretty quickly. A surplus is almost always when the price is above the equilibrium. I think it is always. And a shortage is the same. The reverse, excuse me. So an increase in demand. There are several questions that want you to be able to draw the described change on a graph like this. So you started out with the blue supply and demand curves, and then all of a sudden, now notice here that this is important. Notice the demand changed. There was a shift in demand, okay? And notice that supply didn't change. They didn't say anything about supply changing, right? So this is something that comes up a lot, where we're going to be tempted to mess with both curves, and you don't want to do that. Usually, or I shouldn't say usually, but in very many problems, you have an equilibrium market and something changes, either supply or demand actually shifts. But unless they tell you they both shift, don't shift the supply curve, just move along the curve to the new equilibrium point. And where is that going to be? Well, if this is the new supply curve, then the new demand curve, then I go to where the new demand curve meets the original supply curve, because they didn't tell me that supply shifted, so I keep that curve the way it was. Now what happened is this event caused the price to go up, and it also caused the quantity demanded to go up. And they want you to be able to answer some questions about what would happen if this, there was a shift in demand, and then they'll even throw in a shift in supply in addition, and we'll see what that looks like. But the whole idea is that you understand that just because demand or supply changes or shifts doesn't mean the other one automatically does unless they tell you it did. And so all you have to do is find out where the new equilibrium is and look and see what happened. Well, price went up, quantity demanded went up. Okay. So these are they're really simple in terms of ideas. They're things that happen in the market all the time. but we're not used to reading these graphs based on this new language. And so if you can get comfortable with the shift in demand versus movement along the curve, these get easier. You can start projecting what would happen, where would price have to go. And so what do they want us to do now? As soon as I get this moving, here we go. Okay. All right. And so with the decrease in demand, notice what happened this time. We had an equilibrium at the old number. Now we're going to say, okay, but then at some later point, demand decreased, and look what happened. See if you can predict where the new equilibrium would be in this example. And if you were right, you would see that it went here, right? I just take the new supply curve and see where it intersects the original demand curve. They didn't tell me, excuse me, the original supply curve. The demand curve shifted, it went down, decreased, and I just find out where that intersects the original supply curve, because that didn't change. They didn't tell me to do anything with supply. Okay. And then what they might do now is show us what would happen if both of them changed. Okay, and so here, same thing, except now demand's the original scenario, but now we're going to see a new supply and demand stays the same. So you should be able to identify the new equilibrium at $1.15 million, and there you go. Okay, same thing. Supply, remember, supply decreases by moving up and to the left. And the new equilibrium is going to be 10 and 150 because I keep the old demand curve where it was. All right, now this is what I saw a number of questions in the homework that wanted you to be able to predict what would happen if both of them moved. And the best way is just to draw them, and it should become pretty obvious. A little tricky though, and I'll show you what I mean by this. So here, okay, when the demand went up and the original supply curve is there, we have a new equilibrium where the arrow points. So we can see price went up and quantity went up, but now they're going to say, oh, by the way, not only did demand shift, but supply shifted too. And so now we had to go, this was a two-step problem. You had to go from here to here, and that was the original spot. But then notice how demand shifted out, and this was the most recent demand curve. Excuse me, supply. Now supply shifted out, and we have a new equilibrium. Old demand and supply, new demand, new supply. The net effect here is that price stayed the same and the quantity demanded increased. Now, the thing is, you should have known with no matter what that quantity demanded would increase, because when they both increased, didn't we say they both moved to the right? And so you had to know that both of those equilibrium points, or that the new equilibrium had to be to the right. And that would mean that you had to have an increase in quantity demanded, because you knew that they both moved to the right, because an increase for demand and supply is out to the right. But you didn't know whether price would be the same or not necessarily, because you don't know the shapes of those curves and you don't necessarily know the percentages. Okay. Okay. So that's what they want you to determine, that you knew the quantity demanded had to increase, but you couldn't be sure about the price. You can see the little question marks on the graph. They're kind of small, but that's the kind of question it'll be. You really couldn't say for sure about the price, but you knew for sure about the quantity. And so here, because they're both decreasing, it's the same thing in reverse. We know demand decreases and supply decreases by moving to the left. So you could be certain that the quantity supplied would decrease, but you couldn't be sure about the price because you don't know whether these curves are steep, or didn't tell you how much one increased or decreased. Okay. So if you get this part, you'll get quite a few right answers, because I saw a number of the homework problems with this. Yeah, and you're going to get hit with these too. In this example, you saw supply shift outward, so you knew that would um, cause price to go down, and demand went down as well. So that was your first clue that you could be positive about price going down. But as far as the quantity, question mark. And notice they put the little question marks there when I tapped it the last time. So this is the kind of stuff they want you to be able to do. And I think if you just follow that process of shifting the curves out one at a time, finding the new equilibrium price, and then determining, where what happened between from the original equilibrium to the new one, and whether or not you could be sure what changed. And usually, you can only be sure of one of the two. Either the price you can be sure of, or the quantity, but not both. Very often. Okay. And so in this example, we shifted demand up and decreased supply. It's the opposite of the prior slide. Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop this and call it chapter 3. Okay.